September 1944. A freight train cuts through the golden wheat fields of Nebraska, its wheels grinding against steel rails in a rhythm that sounds almost like a heartbeat. Inside the cattle cars, 43 German prisoners of war press their faces against the wooden slats, watching America pass by in fragments. Red barns, white farmhouses, children waving from dirt roads. They had been told this country was starving, that its people were suffering under the weight of war. But through those narrow gaps, they see something else entirely. Abundance. Space. A kind of prosperity that makes no sense to men who left behind a continent of rubble and ration cards. Among them is Corporal Heinrich Müller, 22 years old, captured 3 months earlier in the hedgerows of Normandy. He carries in his pocket a photograph of his mother standing in front of their apartment building in Hamburg, or what remained of it after the RAF incendiary raids. In his diary, which would later be donated to the National Archives, he wrote that night, "The train stopped at a small station. A woman brought us sandwiches, real meat, white bread. She smiled at us. I did not understand." This moment, this collision between expectation and reality, would repeat itself thousands of times across the American heartland between 1943 and 1946. Nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war were held in camps scattered across 46 states, and tens of thousands of them were assigned to work on American farms, in canneries, in lumber camps. They came as enemies. Many left as something else entirely. This is the story of how captivity became kinship, how propaganda dissolved in the face of everyday kindness, and how the simple act of sharing a meal could unravel years of ideological conditioning. The German soldiers who arrived on American soil in 1943 carried with them a very specific vision of their enemy. For years, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had painted America as a nation in decline, a mongrel society torn apart by racial conflict, economic collapse, and Jewish manipulation. The newsreels shown in German cinemas depicted breadlines, strikes, gangsters ruling the streets. German soldiers were told that American troops were poorly trained, that their equipment was inferior, that their will to fight was weak because democracy made men soft. The Führer himself had declared that the United States was half Judaized and the other half negrified, a civilization incapable of sustaining a real war effort. So when these men were captured, first in North Africa, then in Sicily, then in the massive surrenders following D-Day, they expected to find themselves in a country barely holding together. They expected prison camps that mirrored the harshness they had been taught to associate with their enemies. They expected, perhaps, to be treated the way prisoners were treated in the East, where the rules of war had long since been abandoned. What they found instead was Iowa. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, that they be fed the same rations as the captor nation's troops, that they be allowed to work for wages, that they be housed in conditions comparable to those of the soldiers guarding them. The United States, facing a severe labor shortage as millions of its young men shipped overseas, saw an opportunity. The prisoners would work. They would fill the gaps left by absent farmhands and factory workers, and they would be paid 80 cents a day in camp scrip, which they could spend on cigarettes, toiletries, and small luxuries at the camp canteen. But the Geneva Convention said nothing about what would happen when a German prisoner sat down at an American family's dinner table. It said nothing about what would occur when a farmer's wife packed an extra sandwich in her husband's lunch pail because she knew the POW working their cornfield had mentioned he missed his mother's cooking. It said nothing about the quiet revolution that happens when enemies become neighbors. The first work assignments began in the summer of 1943. The War Manpower Commission, desperate to save crops rotting in fields across the Midwest and South, authorized the use of prisoner labor on farms within a reasonable distance of the camps. The prisoners would be transported each morning in military trucks, supervised by a single guard, sometimes armed, often not, and returned each evening. The farmers would pay the government for the labor. The prisoners would receive their 80 cents a day. In the beginning, there was suspicion on both sides. American farmers, many of whom had sons fighting in Europe, were not thrilled about the idea of feeding and working alongside men who had recently been trying to kill those sons. The prisoners, still steeped in their training, viewed the work as a form of exploitation, another confirmation of what they had been taught about capitalist greed. But something unexpected happened in those fields. Work has a way of breaking down barriers. When you spend 10 hours a day alongside someone, hauling hay bales or picking tomatoes or repairing fence posts, the propaganda starts to fade. You notice things. You notice that the farmer works just as hard as you do. You notice that his wife brings out cold lemonade on hot afternoons, and that she brings enough for everyone, including you. You notice that when the farmer's young daughter falls off her bicycle and scrapes her knee, she runs crying, not away from you but past you, as if you are simply part of the landscape, not a threat. Corporal Miller was assigned to a farm outside of Grand Island, Nebraska, owned by a man named Robert Schneider. The irony of the name was not lost on either of them. Schneider's grandparents had emigrated from Germany in the 1880s. On the first day, Schneider showed Miller the work that needed doing. The corn was ready for harvest, the equipment was old but functional, and the hours would be long. Then he did something Miller did not expect. He asked Miller about his family. Where was he from? Did he have brothers? What had he done before the war? In his diary, Miller wrote, "I told him I had been a student. Engineering." He nodded and said his son was studying engineering at the university in Lincoln before he enlisted. He showed me a photograph. His son was in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. I did not know what to say. He put the photograph back in his wallet and handed me a pair of work gloves. They were new. This pattern repeated itself across the country. In Texas, German prisoners worked in cotton fields alongside Mexican laborers and learned to make tortillas during lunch breaks. In Wisconsin, they helped with dairy operations and were invited to Sunday dinners where they ate pot roast and apple pie and listened to the farmer's wife play piano. In Oregon, they worked in lumber camps and were taught to fish for salmon in the cold rivers. In Pennsylvania, they picked fruit in orchards and were given baskets to take back to camp, more fresh apples than they had seen in years. The food was perhaps the most powerful symbol of all. The standard ration for a German POW in an American camp included meat, fresh vegetables, bread, butter, coffee, and dessert. It was by any measure better than what most German civilians were eating in 1944. It was certainly better than what the prisoners had eaten in the Wehrmacht. One prisoner, interviewed decades later, remembered his first meal in camp. "There was so much food I thought it was a trick. I thought they were fattening us up for something. But the next day, there was just as much. And the day after that. I realized this was normal for them, this abundance. It was their everyday life. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. These men had been raised in a society that glorified sacrifice, that celebrated austerity as a virtue, that promised future prosperity, only after total victory. They had been told that their enemies were weak and decadent, that their material wealth was a sign of moral decay. But here, in captivity, they were eating better than they had as free men. They were working hard, yes, but they were being treated with a basic dignity that contradicted everything they had been taught. And then there were the small kindnesses. The farmer who noticed a prisoner shivering in the early morning cold and brought him an extra jacket. The farm wife who baked a birthday cake for a prisoner who had mentioned, offhandedly, that he was turning 23. The child who drew a picture of a horse and gave it to a prisoner because she had seen him smiling at the animals in the barn. These gestures were not grand or dramatic. They were not part of any official policy or propaganda effort. They were simply the reflexive generosity of people who had been raised to believe that hospitality was a virtue, that hard work deserved respect, and that even enemies were human beings. Not every interaction was warm. There were farmers who refused to speak to the prisoners beyond giving orders. There were communities where resentment ran deep, where the presence of German POWs was seen as an insult to the memory of local boys who had died overseas. There were prisoners who remained committed Nazis, who refused to integrate, who saw kindness as weakness and maintained their ideological rigidity even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. But these were the exceptions. The overwhelming majority of interactions fell somewhere in the middle, a gradual thawing, a slow recognition of shared humanity. The prisoners learned English, they learned American songs, they learned to play baseball, that strange ritual that seemed to occupy such an important place in American culture. They attended movies shown in the camps, carefully selected films that avoided overt propaganda, but subtly reinforced democratic values. They read American newspapers and magazines, which were available in the camp libraries. They began to see the contradictions in what they had been taught. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Klaus Weber, wrote in a letter that was intercepted and preserved by camp censors, "I was told that America was a nation of slaves, that the workers were exploited by Jewish capitalists, that there was no freedom here. But I have seen the farmers who employ us. They work alongside us. They own their land. Their children go to school for free. They complain about their government openly, without fear. They argue about politics at the dinner table and no one is arrested. I do not understand how we were so wrong about this place." The transformation was not universal, but it was widespread enough to alarm some American officials. There were concerns that the prisoners were being treated too well, that the camps were too comfortable, that the work assignments were creating inappropriate fraternization between captors and captives. In 1944, the War Department issued guidelines reminding camp commanders that prisoners were still enemies, that excessive friendliness was inappropriate, that the goal was detention, not rehabilitation. But the guidelines were largely ignored. The labor was too valuable. The relationships had already been formed, and many Americans, particularly those in rural areas who had direct contact with the prisoners, had come to see them not as monsters, but as young men who had been caught up in something larger than themselves. There was a recognition, unspoken but powerful, that these German boys were not so different from American boys, that they had been drafted, that they had followed orders, that they had believed what they were told, and that they were now paying the price for decisions made by men in distant capitals. The symbolic object that appears again and again in prisoner accounts is the sandwich. It seems almost absurdly simple, but it carried enormous weight. In German military culture, food was functional, calories to sustain combat effectiveness. In American culture, food was social, a way of expressing care, of building community, of showing respect. The sandwich, packed by a farmer's wife and handed to a prisoner during a lunch break, represented something more than nutrition. It represented inclusion. It said, "You are working hard, you deserve to eat well, you are part of this, even if only temporarily." One prisoner, interviewed in the 1980s for an oral history project, remembered a specific sandwich with startling clarity. It was ham and cheese on white bread with butter and mustard. There was a pickle on the side, an apple, a piece of chocolate cake wrapped in wax paper. The farmer's wife had written a note that said, "Thank you for your help." I sat under a tree and ate that sandwich, and I cried. I had not cried when I was captured. I had not cried when I learned my brother was killed in Russia. But I cried over a sandwich because it was the first time in years that someone had treated me like I mattered. As the war progressed and the tide turned decisively against Germany, the prisoners in American camps began to receive letters from home, or stopped receiving them. The letters that did arrive painted an increasingly grim picture: cities destroyed, families displaced, food shortages reaching catastrophic levels. The contrast between what the prisoners were experiencing in America and what their loved ones were enduring in Germany created a profound cognitive dissonance. Some prisoners felt guilt. Why should they be safe and well-fed while their families suffered? Others felt anger at the regime that had led them into this disaster. Still others felt a growing sense that perhaps the war had been a terrible mistake from the beginning. The re-education programs implemented in some camps attempted to formalize this transformation. Prisoners were shown films about Nazi atrocities, given books about democratic governance, encouraged to attend lectures about American history and values. The effectiveness of these programs was mixed. Overt propaganda often backfired, reinforcing resistance among the more ideologically committed prisoners. But the informal education that happened on the farms, the daily exposure to a functioning democracy, the experience of being treated with dignity, the observation of a society that, despite its flaws, offered its citizens a level of freedom and prosperity that seemed almost unimaginable. This had a deeper and more lasting impact. By 1945, as Germany collapsed and the full horror of the concentration camps was revealed, many prisoners experienced a profound crisis of faith. Some refused to believe the reports, insisting they were Allied propaganda. Others were forced to confront the reality that they had served a regime capable of unthinkable evil. The American families who had worked alongside these men often found themselves in the unexpected role of counselors, helping the prisoners process their disillusionment and grief. Robert Schneider, the Nebraska farmer, later told a local newspaper, "When Heinrich learned what had happened at the camps, the death camps, he stopped eating for 2 days. He just sat there. My wife finally sat down with him and said, 'You didn't do this, you didn't know, but now you do know. And you have to decide what kind of man you're going to be.'" He started eating again. He worked harder than ever. I think he was trying to prove something to himself. The end of the war brought a new set of complications. The prisoners wanted to go home, but there was no home to return to. Germany was occupied, divided, devastated. Many prisoners requested permission to stay in the United States, but immigration law did not allow for it. They would have to return to Europe, wait the required period, and then apply for immigration through normal channels. Some did exactly that. Others returned to Germany and spent years rebuilding their country, carrying with them memories of Nebraska wheat fields and Wisconsin dairy farms, and the strange kindness of their former enemies. The American families who had employed the prisoners often stayed in touch. Letters crossed the Atlantic for decades. Some families sponsored their former workers' immigration applications. A few prisoners eventually returned to the United States as citizens, settling in the very communities where they had once been held captive. They married American women, raised American children, and became living bridges between two nations that had tried to destroy each other. The story of German POWs in America is not a simple tale of redemption or reconciliation. It is more complicated than that. There were prisoners who remained committed Nazis until their deaths. There were American families who never forgave, who saw the prisoners as nothing more than the enemy. There were moments of tension, conflict, and resentment. But there were also thousands of small moments of connection. Moments that revealed something fundamental about the power of ordinary human decency to transcend ideology and propaganda. What the German prisoners experienced in America was not just material abundance, though that was part of it. What they experienced was a different way of organizing society, a different set of assumptions about the relationship between the individual and the state, a different vision of what human life could be. They saw farmers who owned their land and made their own decisions. They saw workers who could quit their jobs and find new ones. They saw people who criticized their government without fear. They saw a society that, for all its imperfections and contradictions, operated on the principle that ordinary people deserved dignity, opportunity, and a voice in their own governance. This was the real threat to Nazi ideology, not military defeat, but the simple demonstration that another way of life was possible. The propaganda had told them that democracy was weak, that freedom led to chaos, that only a strong authoritarian state could create order and prosperity. But they had seen with their own eyes that this was false. They had lived in a democratic society, even as prisoners, and they had been treated better than they had been treated by their own government. The sandwich, that recurring symbol, represented all of this. It was not just food. It was an expression of a worldview that said, there is enough for everyone, generosity is not weakness, and even strangers deserve kindness. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it carried within it the entire weight of a different philosophy of human existence. In the decades after the war, as Germany rebuilt and transformed itself into a stable democracy, many historians pointed to the Marshall Plan, to the occupation policies, to the political reforms imposed by the Allies. These were certainly important. But there was another factor, less tangible but perhaps equally significant. The hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had spent time in Allied captivity, particularly in the United States, and who had seen firsthand that democracy was not a weakness, but a strength, that prosperity could be widely shared, and that a society built on individual freedom could function and flourish. Heinrich Müller returned to Hamburg in 1946. He found his mother alive, living in a basement because their building had been destroyed. He used his POW wages, he had saved most of his 80 cents a day, to buy food on the black market. He enrolled in university and completed his engineering degree. In 1952, he immigrated to the United States, sponsored by Robert Schneider. He settled in Grand Island, Nebraska, worked as a civil engineer, and raised 3 children. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of his capture, he was interviewed by a local television station. The reporter asked him what he remembered most about his time as a prisoner of war. He thought for a long moment, then said, "The sandwiches. I know that sounds strange, but those sandwiches taught me that the world did not have to be the way I had been told it was. They taught me that there was enough, that people could be kind, that I had been lied to about what mattered. Everything else, the democracy, the freedom, the prosperity. It all started with those sandwiches, with someone deciding that I deserved to eat well, even though I was the enemy. That changed everything." This is the paradox at the heart of this story. The German prisoners came to America as enemies, and in many ways they remained enemies. They had fought for a regime that represented everything America opposed. But in the daily interactions between captors and captives, in the shared labor of harvest and planting, in the simple act of breaking bread together, something shifted. The prisoners learned that they had been lied to, that the world was more complicated than propaganda had suggested, and that their enemies were capable of a generosity that their own leaders had never shown them. The American families, for their part, learned something too. They learned that the enemy was not a monolithic evil, but a collection of individual human beings, many of whom were as much victims of the war as anyone else. They learned that kindness was not weakness, that treating prisoners with dignity did not mean condoning what they had fought for, and that the values they claimed to be defending, freedom, democracy, human dignity, had to be practiced, not just proclaimed. In the end, the story of German POWs in America is a story about the power of everyday life to undermine totalitarian ideology. It is a story about how abundance can be a form of resistance, how kindness can be a form of warfare, and how the simple act of treating people with dignity can accomplish what bombs and bullets cannot. The prisoners came expecting harshness and found generosity. They came expecting exploitation and found respect. They came as believers in a system that promised order through domination, and they left having seen that freedom and prosperity were not contradictions, but complements. The sandwiches were never just sandwiches. They were arguments, made not with words but with actions, about what kind of world was possible. They were demonstrations of a principle that the prisoners had been taught to reject, that human beings, given freedom and opportunity, would choose cooperation over conflict, generosity over greed, and kindness over cruelty. And for many of those prisoners, those sandwiches were more persuasive than any speech, any film, any lecture could ever be. This is why American families secretly loved their German POW workers, and why those workers, in turn, came to love the families and the country that had captured them. It was not because they forgot the war, or because they minimized the evil of the regime they had served. It was because they discovered, in the most unexpected of circumstances, that the propaganda had been wrong, that there was another way to live, and that even in captivity, they could experience a kind of freedom they had never known as free men. The wheat fields of Nebraska still turn golden every September. The barns are still red, the farmhouses still white. And somewhere in those fields, if you know where to look, you can still find the echoes of that strange moment in history when enemies became neighbors, when captivity became education, and when a simple sandwich became a symbol of everything that separates tyranny from freedom.